I want to thank everyone, all of you who are attending today. This is Friday, February 26th, and this is day 2 of the NSF workshop on predicting pandemic emergence. This is a third in a series of 4 workshops on predictive intelligence for pandemic prevention, sponsored by the National Science Foundation. For those of you who were here yesterday, we thank you for returning. And for those who are here for the first time, we want to welcome you. We'd like to begin by welcoming each other as respected colleagues. Our goals here are to think creatively together, and we want to welcome diverse thoughts and perspectives. We recognize that, excuse me, we may not always agree with each other or see the world from each other's perspectives, but we recognize all of the voices here represent independent expertise and valued thinking. As a part of our workshop community, we will all engage with each other in ways that communicate the value placed on everyone's contribution and respect for each other. So on that premise, I'd like to welcome you all and invite your participation in the second day of our workshop. I'd like to begin today by inviting the workshop co-organizers who you all met yesterday to join us once again for some opening remarks. And so we'll begin with Dr. Nina Pfefferman.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I hope that you are excited for today. I hope that the conversations, if you were able to join us yesterday, have led to some great thinking. I don't know about you guys, but I'm a little bit exhausted, and I'm trying to channel all of that exhaustion into energy for what we're going to do today, because I think that as we get going, I will draw energy from the great thoughts that you guys have. So please, as Emmanuel said, today is the day really where we're going to be creative and thinking together the whole day. We're going to launch off from some of the thoughts from yesterday. We'll present some of the recap to you. And then really what we want is everyone to start thinking like, okay, so what did I hear? And how does that change what I'm thinking? And what should we do next? And how do we do this well? And if you guys are only half as brilliant as you were yesterday, we're still going to do amazing things, but I expect you all to be fully as brilliant. So thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you for putting up with us as we figure this out. Welcome.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Pfefferman. And I'd like to invite the other co-organizers as well. Dr. James Moody, would you like to provide any opening comments?
I think Nina said it well. Just looking forward to a great discussion. So I'm not going to take any more of our time for that.
Okay, fantastic. Giannis, Lydia, would either of you like to provide comments as well?
Same here. Good morning. I don't have much to add. I'm very excited about the discussions today. Just from my perspective, I was in a number of breakouts yesterday, and it was interesting to me the various intersections that are multifaceted between different communities. So I think there's quite a bit in that interface.
Yes, same here. I second the comments that were just said. I hope that we're gonna dive a little deeper on what was brought up yesterday and really find the magical wand to solve the issues that were already hinted at yesterday, so we can really make this happen.
Fantastic. Great. Thanks to each one of you. We're going to jump into our agenda for today. What I'd like to do quickly actually is just to review our agenda, just to give everyone just an overview of the activities we're going to be participating in today and some of the things to expect. Sorry, one second.
Yeah. Eccomi.
I think we have some pets that have joined us today as well, which is great. So considering diverse perspectives, I know they have a lot to contribute as well. Sorry for that, but so here's our agenda for today. We're going to start by reviewing the breakout session report outs from yesterday. And so again, we thank you all for your participation in the breakout sessions. We had some really amazing conversation and discussion. We've tried to capture that to the best of our ability in a way that we can speak to today. And so we'll go over information from the breakouts yesterday as a way to just begin to prompt some discussion today. Around 12:15, we'll take a short break. We're going to come back at 12:30 and have a panel discussion around some of those results from yesterday. And so we're going to invite a number of folks to participate in that panel. All of our plenary speakers from day one, you as invited discussants, the symposium chairs, we'd like to have everyone's opinion and to weigh into this process. And once again, as we're discussing throughout the day at any point in time, for instance, during the breakout session report outs, if you do have any comments or questions, we do encourage you to enter them into the chat box, and we will look to those questions into your comments during the panel discussion as well. At 1:20, we're going to have some closing remarks from Katarina Didmar from NSF, who you all heard from yesterday, as an end to our closing session for the morning webinar. Then in the afternoon, we'll get into our breakout sessions once again. We will be using the same link from yesterday for the breakout sessions today. So please make sure that you continue to use that same information. We'll have another breakout session. This will be facilitated. It will be different in content, similar in structure to the breakout sessions yesterday. We'll have an opportunity to revisit some of the themes from the first day, and you'll have the opportunity to volunteer any new insights or difference in perspective that you may have today compared to yesterday, after being able to sit with the information for a while and after our morning discussion of the results. And lastly, we'll have a final discussion. We're going to bring everyone back together just for more thoughts and conversation. We'd really like to know what is rising and bubbling out of all of this conversation, and what we can take moving forward, information that's actionable as well. So this is an overview of our agenda for today. And without any further delay, I'd like to move us towards our discussion of the results from day one. And so for this, I'm going to turn things back over to the co-chairs for the workshop to discuss some of their insights and things that they observed and took away from our conversation yesterday. And we do have the slides prepared for any of those discussions. So if you would like us to show any visual aids, just please give us an indication and we can do so. And all of the co-chairs know
Who's
what to first. So I think we should we can begin our discussion. We can go in order if we'd like, and just begin with the report outs from breakout session number one, and we can start with group number one. And so I know I facilitated that group, and Dr. Aurora was our technical chair. So if you'd like to speak to some of the insights, you're welcome to share your screen, and if you'd like me to share mine or any of the slide material, I can do that as well.
Yeah, sure, that's great. All right, so for the first group, the first breakout session, we had some overlap. So maybe just talk about the first breakout, group one, second breakout, group one. We had some overlapping members in both, but also some that changed. But the insights overall and comments, I thought that were quite striking on the barriers on fundamental, but also basically basic and applied were quite common. They were really just one comment that was different. So I will lump the comments from both discussions in, but feel free to jump in as well, Emmanuel, if you see if some comments also then bubble up to that point. So let me pull out my notes. Is this beeping on my end or okay? Hopefully not.
We should totally have had the Jeopardy music song keyed up.
I'm writing that down.
Or at least Hollywood Squares, given the
Yeah.
given the Zoom.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Yes. Okay. All right. Sorry, it took me a while to get back the file. All right. So so some of the comments that that were really interesting were colored by the actual specialties and backgrounds of everybody, and we had a very interesting mix. With the focus on the modeling aspect that dwelled in the different approaches, particularly for networks and graphs. And one comment that had bubbled up at the time that I found interesting in terms of barriers in methodology to tackling really the basic research aspect for pandemic prediction was the fact that a lot of the theoretical or frameworks that were developed, for example, for network modeling, assume that we of course know the network, and so a lot of then the development that is foundational is about then how do you compute, of course, the risks, how heterogeneity, how the properties of the network are going to lead to various outcomes, how measures are going to be also affecting the outcomes. But in reality, most of the time for epidemics, obviously we don't have that network, and that's a very actually difficult information and data to even obtain real time, particularly when the pandemic is hitting, and we realize that there are heterogeneous that might not just be just socioeconomic, but it could be heterogeneous in terms of host disparities that make it also more prone to a new pathogen, more prone to transmit in particular environments or in particular populations. And so that was to me a highlight of, in some sense, of an illustration of how the disconnect between really theoretical approaches or even experimental approaches, but asking the question in some sense, starting with a very important assumption of knowing what the layout is, when in reality, that is the biggest gap that we have before in practice. And so I'm saying that because it brings together the two breakout sessions, the fundamental and the applied. And I think that it really illustrates why it's so important to really connect fields and frame questions very early on by having the different fields and potentially practitioners, even if one is not thinking of going and practicing or translating at that stage, but formulating that question from the beginning with that input can really change completely the impact of that research, because obviously then different questions then emerge, and this was also highlighted in that discussion, because then some of the biggest unknown might be, well, if you have uncertainty of your network, then how would that in fact change any of these predictions or theoretical results, right? And that could lead to a whole new set of tools and theoretical developments that are linked to the uncertainty to the underlying network to look at robustness of interventions or any robustness of structural, but also predictive robustness of what will be developed otherwise. And so I think that was for me a very important illustration with a concrete example, but a lot of the other points we discussed were a bit similar in the sense that there's the question of collaborating, for example, with economists, and which came out a few times. We had a few economists in both breakout 1 and 2, where of course this is critical for tackling the real problem. We need to understand the socioeconomic disparities, the impacts of interventions, the incentives, but also the approaches, both from the humanities research in behavior that has been rooted in economics, and bring that into then the epidemiology modeling. And that was something that a theme that came out multiple times through different comments and through different lens. But the economics again field was, I think, an example I want to highlight, because it's sort of a field that sits around at the middle of so many different things, and there's so many different things, and the tools and the way of absorbing the tools of other fields was mentioned by one of our participants as being sort of emblematic of an area in a field that knows how to take tools from other fields and sort of apply it in their own context. But then maybe what we also need is make sure that when that happens, that we also have the practitioners that and those that develop those tools really also able to communicate to those that are then sometimes scavenging them or using them for their other application, because obviously otherwise those tools can be used without understanding their limitations, over interpreting their predictive power, for example, or adapting them in a context that violates fundamental assumptions. And so again, the importance of discussing across fields and tackling barriers that are not just sort of technical barriers, they're really communication barriers and an acknowledgement of the importance of other fields barriers, which is also a common theme that came about, like the silos that come with the idea also that maybe we might not always not only understand but also acknowledge or appreciate the contributions of other fields, because in some sense we do not understand them. And so the very importance of doing that on both sides, whether we're talking about theoretical tools being taken to be applied, the practitioners or the applied side of it should understand the limitations, and that's often also missed. And then vice versa, the application domain motivating a question for theoreticians or somebody that's more on the fundamentals, and understanding that before starting that research, understanding that the question is formulated with the right assumptions and the right framework from the application domain is so critical. So this came out multiple times. Now, in terms of barriers, to how do we achieve that, and the other questions related to barriers, there were a lot there, of course, that of the suggestion discussion that ended up always coming back to funding, structural barriers. We mentioned that a little bit yesterday in the closing remarks. And so there are structural barriers from the funding perspective, that is not just the amount of funds, but really the sustainability of the funds. So for example, seed funds that encourage collaborations were mentioned, and we spent a little bit of time about that. And the importance that of having such funds not be, short term, because by the time one really understands the language of the other domain, that sometimes can take essentially a year. And so then at that point, if there is no way to sustain that conversation, then it's nice, but it doesn't really have the impact that the interaction synergies could have led to. We also had a really nicely a contribution of a PhD student that was in fact an interdisciplinary group program, and so he also talked from his perspective on the advantages of having such a program, but also the potential barriers along the way. And that wasn't discussed per se, but that's something that came out from the two breakouts that I want to sort of expand on the discussion. It's also really the training of the human capital at these interfaces, right? And that's something that, of course, is linked also to everything else, to the funding, to the ability to have these synergies. But that is the thing that, in fact, takes the most time and really requires to have the infrastructures and then the expertise and all those communications already in place to make sure that we have that time and care in training the next generation that can speak the different languages. But there too, structural challenges come in, of course, and that's something that came up also in the journal discussion, because we need to ensure that these individuals can also be recognized for their unique set of skills, even if they don't fit in a box. And so that means that, incentives for hiring programs, tenures, of course, then and having sustained funding to make sure that they can have a career later on, all are so critical. And so I think it's really important from all the points that were made to think really holistically. And I think everybody's on board, but there are so many obstacles, even whatever angle this is looked at, whether it's within institutions, between institutions and funding agency, not just the amount, but a real care to sustaining efforts and the rewarding systems of the different fields being a little bit shaken to be able to open up to rewarding also that kind of risk-taking of research at the interface, where all the challenges identified. Now, we didn't talk as much about how do we solve this, though, and so I'm hoping that in the discussions of today we will have more of the beginning of that discussion that we started yesterday be expanded, and for us to really come up with at least seed ideas to how to do that. One analogy that came up yesterday and also in the groups about that is really taking a very, very deep look at fields that actually succeeded in doing that. And there's really, of course, the weather prediction and climate modeling, which really were, in some sense, the canonical example after SARS, for example, in Canada, for the government to in fact start a whole program to develop a task force and human capital after SARS to have a predictive platform and tools for the government to use for pandemics. And that's something I'm talking about from my experience. But that was also mentioned yesterday and I think in other groups, because that is really the example that we need, I think, to dive in to see how is that done. It's also fields that are completely different, from chemistry to physics to radioactive transfer to fluid mechanics to computing data, sensors. So it's vastly also diverse, but of course a little bit less of complexity with human behavior, sociology, economics, right? So there's that other aspects that need to be brought in here and thought through also very carefully of how do we integrate all this to build that. But structurally, that is an example that came up, and that was that as a potential example for us to maybe dive into more for solutions on these barriers for interdisciplinary research, fundamental or applied. And one last point that was touched on briefly, but we didn't expand too much on, but that could be a seed also for further discussions, is comparison also. Sorry?
You're fine. Please continue.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Where also the particularly for pandemics that are international, like for weather, also forecasting climate, you need to track things outside of one country. But of course, so there's cooperative agreements for data sharing and collaborations. And similarly for pandemics, there was also a point that was highlighted, and I think everybody agreed, that was also maybe a structural difficulty, but I think it's tackled in some organizations, but bring that at the forefront is that, of course, international collaborations and potentially surveillance and potentially funding that encourage or at least support, or at least doesn't discourage international collaborations would be so critical also for pandemics and epidemics, obviously, where the pathogens can arise from anywhere. So it's not so much on the interdisciplinary portion, but we still talked about that because it was part of those structural challenges in sharing and developing this effort. The one point about the funding that was also mentioned that I thought was really interesting. I always thought about it in this way, but that we have there having an economist in the group was fantastic because we could actually learn the terminology for it. The boom bust cycle is what he refers to, which was very very interesting as a boom bust cycle for both interest but also funding, as being something in fact documented and studied in various economic contexts, but also to think about how in fact that can hurt that sustained effort for building the human capital and the platforms that we would be talking about here for really prediction and management and prevention. And so to use again from an interdisciplinary point of view, not only at the scientific level, the exchanges between fields, but to solve the hurdles and the structural difficulties, to also try to steal ideas and combine them from different fields, because different fields might have studied those hurdles in another context. And so that was another point that I thought was really interesting. And I think there are, of course, a lot of other things that were discussed there. So I don't know how much more time I have, but I can sprinkle them as we continue the discussion, or keep going. Maybe you can let me know, Emmanuel, so I make sure to leave time for the others.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, no, I think we have a significant amount of time in this first session.
Okay,
so
all right, sounds good. Okay, sounds good. All right, and so then in terms of the other big, in terms of interdisciplinary challenges, both again on the applied and fundamental, but on the applied in particular, that came up is of course the data. And I already mentioned that in the sense that there's a disconnect between the data available and what maybe, from a modeling perspective, we're investing in terms of efforts. And so the data was something that was discussed in the groups, and really how do we aggregate it or not? How do we in fact again build platforms for that sharing? And that always goes back again to that those structural challenges for managing data pools or ownership or redistribution, reformatting, and the need for having sustained support to doing that, because the data is so critical at these stages. And that was discussed a few times, I think, also in other sessions. But of course, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of modeling, but the key, the golden piece that's missing is that data, right? And so it's really critical from a practitioner point of view, or at least from a deployment and application point of view, that we also sort that out, regardless of the efforts that are also done in terms of new ideas for modeling and platforms and cross-fertilization of ultimately will be king in determining what is really accurate or not, what is really useful or not, what has been effective or not. And I think that was also something that was really interesting. In terms of other, let me see.
I'll take a quick moment just to note some of the themes that were related to the the report outs that we're describing now. And I'm sorry I didn't do this initially, but our first conversation was focused on integration across disciplines. And so a lot of the, I just wanted to remind everyone of that. So a lot of the topics that came up, within particular disciplines, working across different disciplines, some of the structural issues that came up within universities and academia, as well as barriers to international collaboration. So all of that was related to this idea of integration across disciplines. So I just wanted to sort of remind everyone of that, just in sort of setting the context. And then our latter discussion on applied research was focused on prediction, detection, control, and prevention. So as we're describing a lot of these themes, I just want to remind everyone of that context, because it's also helpful then in noting some of the differences in what you'll hear in these report outs as well. So sorry to interrupt, I thought it was a good time to interject.
No, that's great, because I was talking about many things, but it's good to make sure that
I think we may be having audio difficulty for a moment. Is anyone else experiencing this? Is it just me?
No, me too.
Yep.
Okay,
We can hear you.
just making sure. Okay, Dr. Barurba, I believe you are back. Your audio cut out for a second, but it looks like you're back.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. So maybe I was talking alone. Sorry about that. Okay. So I was saying that one other challenge that came up that I mentioned already a little bit, but might be a little bit outside of our scope, but it's up for discussion, was of course the reward system. And so you mentioned already within institution, between institutions, but also in even journals and societies, meetings, awards. So all of that also came up because some of the participants that are here are already between fields and interdisciplinary, and they had a lot of them very, very interesting and original different paths to get to this interdisciplinary field. And so that was discussed as something that, even though people might be really successful in doing that, they do still sometimes feel or are being made to feel as outsiders in certain meetings or in their sort of maybe what could be considered the core discipline, just because they are in between. So this is something that maybe is outside the scope, but maybe not, because that could also be an opportunity to think about ensuring that cross-disciplinary sessions in the primary conferences are also, encouraged somehow as part of a program that would be doing, trying to tackle and encourage that human capital development. So I think that's why I wanted to point it out, because it's a true challenge on the ground, but also maybe also a hint at ideas of initiatives that could go with a program like this one, to make sure that there are venues where this type of original paths are in fact supported and celebrated and rewarded in their own right. So I think I'll stop here and jump in and sprinkle with the other groups as we move along.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And you made a lot of very interesting points that I hope that we get to discuss. Some of the things that stood out for me as well with this idea of, again, we sort of had the economics perspective in our group, which was great, having multiple economists that were in our group, and sort of speaking about modeling human behavior and decision-making, especially not as a constant, the way that it can be assumed in some models, but getting that robustness. And I know you mentioned the boom bust cycle. There was this idea of like chasing pandemics, right? Or like chasing the next disease in order to have sustained funding for these things that we now recognize are important and need to be supported consistently. So that's a theme that you touched on, I thought was also very important. And then one thing that really strikes me is just, as you mentioned, the structure of incentives in academia, and now questioning whether or not they're designed for the world that's emerging, right? Have we been incentivizing science in the right way to protect us against these large scale global threats? And you know, it makes me wonder whether or not there's flexibility in this system, you know, in order to be able to change and to accommodate the world that we need to build collectively, especially now as universities are considering such fundamental changes in their operations and their business structures due to COVID, right? Is this an opportunity to reimagine different aspects of academia in order to promote the type of science that we need moving forward? So just wanted to add a couple of those thoughts as well. But thank you so much. That was a very thorough and amazing recap of the conversation. Having been there, I can say it was a great recap of the conversation.
Thank you, Manu.
Appreciate it. Thank you. So next, we'd like to invite Dr. Pfefferman to provide some remarks regarding the results of breakout session 2, or group number 2, both in the first and the second breakout session throughout the day.
Hey, oh, thank you so much. Okay, so I confess that I probably will use some slides to lean on, because yes, because it's I know it's pathetic to say that 11:30 a.m. is early, but it's very early. So I'm gonna do that, and hopefully oh, I'm not allowed to.
So Nina, I am sharing for you, unless you would like to share. It should be up on the screen right now.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. Okay. So our mission in breakout session 1, group 2, was to talk about integration across scales and the challenges for pandemic prediction across scales, especially from the perspective of trying to be interdisciplinary about that. So some things that emerged from the conversation. We talked about each of our, so you guys were all in breakout sessions before, so the conversation was wide and varied, but we were trying to narrow it down. And so we had some invitations to think specifically about what our independent fields contributed to the ideas of integration across scale, and then to see whether or not there were some commonalities that emerged from that. So just as a laundry list of things that we thought that we had as tools in our toolkit together to bring to the table, we were talking about things like deep learning to evaluate viral escape routes and predict mutation from selective pressures, as opposed necessarily just to the mutability of pathogens. We talked also about having tailored and heterogeneous dynamic models that could be used to detect departures from expected normals. And so while we were talking very specifically about certain examples of that, I think that really highlights one of the utilities of modeling itself, of not just making these concrete predictions of, oh, next Tuesday, expect this thing to happen, but going, okay, what are the bounds of stochastic reasonability about what we should expect to see, and how far from that can we push earlier and earlier to notice if something is going a little bit wonky. And so we wanted to think about that in terms of improved detection of rapid change. We also talked about some using the field, so borrowing a little bit from what Lydia was saying in her group, borrowing the existing tools that fields had developed within disciplines to tackle disciplinary problems, but were then already natively established to look at these interdisciplinary challenges, specifically in the context of pandemic prediction. So one that was proposed was really a community ecology perspective to provide unifying and explicit conceptual framework for how processes across scales of organization impact each other as an emerging dynamic. And that having that framework allowed us to more explicitly and concretely connect processes across different scales. Now, of course, enacting that in quantitative models is a whole other whole other kettle of fish. But having that conceptual framework, and community ecology is of course not the only field that has developed such conceptual frameworks. So I think the take-home message we wanted from that is that there are such frameworks that exist. They're just right now quite well developed within their disciplines, and those disciplines usually aren't pandemic. So again, that idea of borrowing well-studied ideas. Okay. Oh, thank you so much. Then embedding the ecological mechanisms into the landscapes in which they occur. So having really great maps, having really great explicit ties to the environment, whether that's it's explicitly spatial or explicitly process driven, but rooting the biological concept of scale into other physical and temporal and social scales. So that both gave us a deeper toolkit, but also potentially identifying mismatches in scale. So using, again, trying to take things that already exist and look at them from a slightly different perspective in order to leverage them well. I thought it was a really cool idea that someone said in talking about this particular concept of, well, okay, but when we have these ideas, it may not be that anything looks strange or provides an early warning signal of emerging pandemics in any one scale, but the mismatch across the scales is the thing that starts triggering warning signs and maybe makes us think. And so I thought that was a lovely moment to note that. We also talked a little bit about ecological niche modeling as models that define the abiotic and environmental context of biotic ranges of viability. And so of course the traditional way is sort of animal and plant species ranges, but we of course also in the last decades have been moving into pathogen ranges. And so to enable us to sort of figure out the where and when in spatiotemporal scales, but of course also niche modeling isn't just limited to environment in the traditional sense. We as hosts are the environment, and maybe looking at ecological niche modeling as niches of humans as well as the landscape for pathogens. We talked also about sort of computational platforms at the atomistic level. So models from physics, physical chemistry, and machine learning, doing iterative design on a molecular scale to look at potential therapeutics. Sorry, there's great chat about some early work for containment. Yes, definitely. These are not meant to be new thoughts. These are meant to be things we thought would be useful. So please don't mistake me as us thinking that nothing's been done. There's so much work on a lot of this that's been done that's awesome. We're definitely just trying to catalog so that we can sort of provide unified frameworks and sort of baselines for moving forwards as we come together. So that instead of having to know the particular disciplinary depth, we can just tell people like, oh, if you've never worked in this part, here are some things we've got, and those already exist, and those perspectives that can be really useful. So thank you so much. But yes, please don't think that we're reinventing the wheel naively. We were just going like, we've got these tools, and some of them are even represented in the room, and they could be really awesome. So also, if Rita, if I could go to the next slide, please. Thank you so much. We talked also then about contributions to pandemic prediction that involved calibration of agent-based models. So using those to generate synthetic data for training our other models in informed ways. And then the conflicts between continuous time and stationary and discrete time and analyzing truly stationary dynamics that may be represented aggregate averages. Even if we're not talking about mean field approximations, if we're talking about, for example, static networks versus dynamic networks, and some tools to look at some of those things. And then we talked also about sort of dynamic fuzzy feedback control as a perspective and toolkit also to aid in flexibility of response. And of course, we were thinking still, since it was session one, we were talking about sort of basic and fundamental research challenges. So not so much the applied idea of flexibility and response, but the foundational understanding of what does it take? What would we need to understand and detect to be able to respond essentially in greedy time, in making the best approximate choice that we've got next, and understanding how far away that might be from a curated optimal path. So I think those were all of the actual contributions we talked about. Thank you so much. Then moving on to, we talked about barriers in interdisciplinary collaboration that stemmed from our own disciplines. And so of course, as with everything that Lydia encapsulated so beautifully also, communication with other disciplines was the biggest overarching theme, and developing that language. And while we had some people in the room who were natively comfortable speaking many languages, which was amazing, I think the sentiment of, again, that duration and investment of time and energy to establish common language and make sure that there's clarity of communication really came to the forefront. And again, a theme that's coming up over and over, the lack of reward structure for interdisciplinary work. Figuring out, of course, we can train wonderful interdisciplinary students, but they're still going to have to get hired if they want to stay in academia by a disciplinary department. They're going to have to explain in their elevator pitch what they do in a way that captures well the chunk of research that they've carved out for themselves and their perspective. And that's a really complicated thing. And I say that as someone who's been really lucky to be successful in interdisciplinary stuff. I don't know how to tell someone else to be as lucky as I've been. And I think that our community in breakout session 1.2 agreed that we didn't really know how to carve those paths well. And that was somewhat linked to data, but also somewhat linked to institutional structure of research itself. And we thought that industry handled that a little bit better than academia. And so maybe we could figure out from industry. But of course, industry is usually motivated actually by money and research work, as opposed to the publications or the prestige. Yes, and so there's a comment in the chat right now also about trivializing research that's interdisciplinary. And oh God, yes, if we could figure out together how to reframe the questions so that the commonality is viewed as being as valuable as increasing disciplinary depth, that would be awesome. So yes, and there's a suggestion that we could look at the interdisciplinary labs that have been training students for a long time. It's not magic. I agree it's not magic. Also, I'm the director of an interdisciplinary center. So again, please don't think that we're saying that this has never been done. We're cataloging the things that would be good for us all to be thinking about. And while it's not magic, it's also not easy. So thank you for that comment. We talked about data architecture itself as a potential route for interdisciplinary understanding that could foster both the value of that work and the communications among disciplines, and using that as a sort of Rosetta Stone to understand how we were all talking about things. But of course, that's not without its own communication challenges and infrastructure needs to share. We also talked about finding the right shared questions. So just the fact that I can envision in my discipline what the other person's discipline would be useful if they could answer for me doesn't mean that that's interesting for them. And so being able to find those shared right questions seemed like an important thing. So we also have a comment about how to avoid reducing everything to a lowest common denominator. Yes, absolutely. These are rich and challenging questions. And I don't mean to suggest that there isn't depth itself in the interdisciplinarity, but to get to that depth, first, we do have to meet each other at a shallower level in order to establish that communication. And so I think thinking all of these things through together is going to be an important step for integrating both. So as Lydia's breakout session across disciplines, but certainly as we're trying to integrate across scales. Right, many of our different fields operate at different scales because that is the framework of the field. And so that involves some technical challenges as well.
Just a quick note too, don't worry about the chat for now, because we're going to revisit all of these comments during the panel discussion.
Right, so, thank you so much. Thank you, that's a very good point. All right, thank you. So if we could go to the next slide. Awesome. Okay. So we did then talk about gaps that needed to be filled from other disciplines in order to stimulate collaboration. So while the first part was about what do we need to bring to the table in order to get there, then now it was more like, okay, what do we need others to do in order for this structurally to work for us? And so with those, instead of the laundry list of what came out of it, I thought it would be nice to organize these into the general themes that emerged. So we had three three primary themes. I think we have a few others also later, but really the idea being that we had some knowledge basis gaps, some capability gaps, and some incentive gaps. And so our knowledge basis, the behavior of systems at very different organizational scales. So if you're a cellular biologist or a biochemist, and looking at things at that scale, then the native organizational scale of the complexity of those systems may have some commonalities in the abstract from things like populations and nations dealing with each other in socio-political structures around surveillance, but they're not easy to notice they are appropriate, and the communication about those is technical. And so some knowledge gaps of how those systems behave, each of us tends to focus on some range of comfort and scale. And so bridging across those seemed an important categorical knowledge gap to address. And then also researcher networks, identifying who your likely collaborators might be and where to find them. So having some more truly interdisciplinary sort of matchmaking meetings we thought might, which are already done. Again, everybody, all of this stuff has, like, we're not suggesting that people haven't done this, but we were thinking that this might be useful going forwards. And so for just learning other disciplines' languages, how might we do that? Okay, and then we had some capability gaps. What are the drivers of the dynamics in other systems? So are they the same types of things? Can we just assume that, oh, if we had perfect math, could we move it over here and just change what the names of the categories and parameters mean? Or would we have to fundamentally restructure that? And then how do we translate between computational or data-rooted fields and fields that are either purely qualitative or purely theoretical? And we thought that those were sort of categories and seams of opportunity for developing better communication to study integration of scale. And then, of course, the mismatches in excitement and reward. And I think that's pretty much what we talked about in the first session's second group. Oh, okay. So then moving on to the second session's second group, we were talking about endogenous versus exogenous threat. So what we talked about then is sort of processes that are native to a system that don't change the fundamental behavior of that system, and processes that do provide a sudden shock or maybe come from outside. And there was a great understanding in the conversation that those may actually not be the same things, that just being endogenous doesn't mean that it's slow and predictable, and just being exogenous doesn't mean that it's sudden or vast in its perturbation. So for the contributions part, we talked about what our fields could contribute to this conversation. We thought about improving in-country capacity for detection and response as a global system. We talked about improving access to large volumes of verifiable data by creativity and data collection techniques, and sort of being more flexible in how we view data sources and how we might access them, and getting creative about that. And then we thought maybe improving understanding of the transmission for rare and harmless pathogens that don't get as much attention. So not just those boom bust cycles that Lydia had mentioned, which are really important to acknowledge as a limitation in how we view these things. But so now that's sort of switching from important to important to important, but actually understanding all of this is rooted in how those things are different from the consistently boring ones. And so focusing some real study on consistently boring things. Sorry, I don't mean boring. I mean relatively less pressing in the moment, but of course scientifically fascinating. And so focusing on the things that are the sort of bread and butter of what the systems do, and providing that as a baseline for comparative analysis, we thought would be very useful. Again, already being done, not suggesting that people aren't doing it, definitely being done. And we thought just understanding better markers of viruses were contributions that would all be valuable to make sure that we kept at the forefront of our thinking. Next slide, please. Okay, so we talked about then if we could use some improved integrated multi-systems modeling or planning tools. And it was suggested that there are some really great systems models developed, DARPA military type models of social systems that involve all sorts of synergistic dynamics to try and predict outcomes of systems and what impacts different interventions would take. And so I think, again, many of us work on building exactly these kinds of things, but to have the full suite of attention in the same way. And then improved understanding, of course, of network-based epidemiological dynamics in the context of viruses. So things like identifying subnetworks of greatest risk and the critical parameters for the behavior of dynamics in those subnetworks, and then how they synergize to emerge in whole system property, meaningful thresholds in whole system behavior, and to improve understanding of where and how dynamics connect the graph that might improve control or disconnect the graph that might improve control. We talked about some formal risk assessment protocols that might help us to prioritize resources and efforts, since this was the more applied discussion. So as we were talking about sort of gradual transitions or sudden threats, thinking in real time about how those might help us shift among things that are potentially sudden versus gradual. So trading the long term off of the short term understanding. And then we decided that the conversation itself was a little bit more complicated than our first panel discussion had been for many of the folks in the room. And we decided that itself showed that there was some meat inside this question, that it wasn't just trivial to answer what we would need in order to address the differences that might be relevant in terms of anticipating with and noticing endogenous versus exogenous threats and risks. And that figuring that out might actually be a good contribution itself. When do we need these things, and for what are they useful? And thank you. And so then, as with all of the other cases, our barriers to interdisciplinary collaboration really did boil down to communication and reward structure and funding. We talked a little bit more in this group about how funding might help with some interdisciplinary work. We thought maybe, could there be interdisciplinary rubrics, acknowledging that it's quite hard to get out of your own disciplinary head as you're evaluating things. So if we were envisioning a panel trying to review our grant, what would we want to tell them or do to try and support more interdisciplinary opportunity? And so we thought maybe bringing in people, more people who were non-researcher experts in the field for some of these things. And again, some of this is being done. So not to suggest that we are blind to the efforts that are there. Again, this was meant as a framework for let's coalesce the ideas moving forwards in a way that might be a useful reference and focus us. And so we thought also that more innovation clearly results when people with different mindsets come together. And so so making sure to reinforce that understanding and remind everybody serving as reviewers that what they're doing is evaluating the whole, not the parts. So we thought those would be useful to keep in mind. And then thank you. And then we talked about those gaps that might need to be filled either from our own disciplines or from others. And we sort of broke that down in the conversation from natural and physical sciences perspective versus social sciences perspective. So we thought maybe lack of understanding of physical threats and aspects of threats needed some method of translation. Is it math? Is it data? We needed some kind of Rosetta Stone. And from among the social sciences, we thought we really needed to improve venues for interaction and identify the people who could act as bridges instead of just the bridged ideas themselves. So, thank you.
Fantastic. This is an awesome overview. Definitely appreciate it. We see lots of similarities with this distinct differences that came up in the conversation as well. I want to see any, I know that our technical chairs and our facilitators are on the line as well. I think Rita, you were the chair for the session. Anything that you wanted to add?
Nothing else from my side. Thanks, Emmanuel.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Let's see. So I'd like to move on then to group number 3. And I believe the technical chair for the third group was Dr. Moody.
That's me. Yep. Just a second here.
Yep, not a problem.
All right. First of all, thanks again to everyone for all the help in the discussion. We were an undisciplined group, and so Heather and Fred had their hands full dealing with us not paying attention to their guidelines. That continues on to the summary in that I rewrote all the slides, so that's why I'm using our piece instead of yours. But that's not a reflection of the original work. It's a reflection of our somewhat cat herd like mentality. So it was a lot of fun. I think people had lots of good things to say. I think that our original session, the theme was designed around this integration of real world with foundational progress, which was probably too broad of a question. It was intended to mean, basic like mathematical and chemistry and biology research versus what's going on, in a hospital sort of continuum. And but the people in the room, what we sort of discovered is that we're already pretty interdisciplinary, at least as the collection that we were there, and felt comfortable working across disciplines. The real problem was more this applied pure collaboration issue and this disconnect between applied and basic research. And so that led us to that felt like a much harder problem than the interdisciplinary one, in some sense, because we have so much work in NSF and other sort of universities to build centers that do this work and make this their mission, that there's something of a rubric there to do that. Whereas the applied version seems a little less well fleshed out, though, again, this is all bounded by what we know. One thing that came up, of course, was that part of the problem with how you do this balance is that there's an inherent ignorance in the nature of what the next big problem, applied problem, is going to be. We spend a lot of time essentially looking backwards. We have no choice. And so we spend a good deal of time solving the last problem and not the next problem, because we don't know what the next problem is going to be. And so the fundamental research necessarily has to be broad and unguided. And so finding ways to link that to what the people are doing on the ground is a bit of a problem. One idea that's come up a couple times, I've seen it in the chat and I've seen it come through as well yesterday when we were talking, is this notion of a matching markets for problem-seeking solutions. And the thinking here is that we're all in our heads, either in our disciplines or in our labs or in our centers, trying to imagine what the problem is for someone else, as opposed to just people coming out and saying, hey, I have this problem, please solve it for me. And so there should be some way to create a classic two-sided matching market problem here for problems versus for solutions. And I think that where this bridges this pure applied collaboration issue or problem-solving issue is that on the pure side, we often need to simplify problems dramatically in order to, fit them into the analytic framework that is tractable, which is not to trivialize. That's exactly just that tractability is necessary for making fundamental progress. And so that simplification, though, feels trivial or lacks essential reality for those who are doing applied problems. So figuring out how to make that this is a problem we're solving versus this is a problem I can solve bridge might be solved by some of these kinds of matching market ideas. One simple way to perhaps at least push in this kind of direction that came up was to increase the communication with people who are working on the ground. And the point here is to, and this was brought up again in the bigger discussion yesterday, which is that pandemic prep is a special case of hazard preparedness, for which there is a long-standing field of work out there that's coming out of disasters research, from at least from the 20s and 30s, all the way through to works in the various and different sorts of natural disasters that we're used to thinking of. And so if we can leverage some of the ideas that go through there that sort of are trying to balance between this, how do we predict where the next bad event is going to be versus how do we get ready so that wherever that event happens, we can squash it and deal with it quickly. Those are two, not necessarily competing, but there are two different routes to the ultimate goal of minimizing the damage that comes from whatever hazard is coming out of here. And we should be engaging with that research community very directly to the best we can. Practitioners, can imply can essentially help us with this. And the thinking is that there should be ways for us to work closer with practitioners, people who are on the ground. And figuring out how to do this is difficult. Oftentimes those who are working on the ground don't feel that they're engaged or invited to some of the conversations. There's a lot of academic conversations that occur that don't include people who are engaged on the ground at the time. And that makes it a little bit more difficult to identify the problems that they care about, because again, we get caught up in our more tractability kinds of questions. One way to think about this, we're trying to be proactive and think about mechanisms, is that NSF does have this broader implications, broader impact section of every proposal that I think often gets trivialized in the proposal section, that it's not treated as relevant as it might be. And if there was a way to help train reviewers to and include practitioners on the review panels that really do pay attention to that broader impacts, that might at least align the incentive structures for investigators to make sure that their proposals are answering questions that people really want to have answered. And this then brought us to, of course, the elephant in the room across a lot of this, which is resources and funding. And it strikes us that one of the problems here is that there is something of a mismatch between funding agencies and the ways in which these agencies can be effective in their promotion of either innovative work or relevant work. And part of this has highlighted by the contrast between NSF and NIH, which is NSF is flexible, fast, and creative, or at least can be, but generally, particularly for the kinds of questions we're talking about in this workshop, the budgets tend to be much more meager. NIH, on the other hand, has more money, particularly money dedicated towards health and health results outcomes, but is famously stolid in its approach to the review process and creativity. So it ends up being a much more incremental investment as opposed to foundational investments. And that raises the question, of course, is how you provide ways to work these guys together. And there are joint NSF, NIH collaborations and funding opportunities that have been, we think, quite successful. There are some folks in the room who have been experienced with those. And perhaps the obvious solution to this problem is to do both and, right? So to get these groups working together as best they can. And so I think that our general thinking was that some work along those lines would be useful. It raised this other question, which is how do we bring others to the table that are relevant to these discussions and have resources to bring to bear that shouldn't be siloed in their own sets, of course, CDC, DOD, private industry, and foundations. This is if we're going to do this right, this has to be essentially an economy-wide investment in trying to prevent this next thing from happening. And so we need to make sure that everyone's at the table. We then went on to a little bit to talk about barriers to this research progress. We deliberately set off at the beginning that we wanted to talk about barriers other than money and resources, because obviously we need more. We always need more. So that's not a particularly creative thing to say. It's just true. And so how can we figure out how to put this in the directions that we want to sort of, given the fixed pie, how do we slice it up? We recognize that there's at least somewhat of a low investment in research on what are currently rare pathogens. There's a nice point that was made that most pathogens persist in the population in the wild at very low levels, much lower than any SIR model would predict that it should, right? And so how's that possible, right? How is it possible that these bugs can stay endemic in critters out in the wild for so long, just waiting to pop over at any moment? And how do we make sense of that? So a little bit of funding that could help identify and monitor these kinds of viruses and other bugs that are at risk to creating a pathogenic jump would be quite useful. Figuring out how to do this in a way that is safe and useful, of course, is important. And so we need to identify how these intersect with human populations and how they might jump. And so there's both a what we need to study and where we need to study it kind of question here that we think is an underinvestment. there's a deep need for these pre-indicators and data that helps us identify early signals. And so the point here, of course, is that we can't wait for people to be in a hospital to start doing research. At that point, you're probably too late. And we're getting evidence now, for example, that there probably were multiple spots of COVID-19 popping up around the world before we really recognized it. And so by the time you detect it in one patient, the disease may have spread already further than you care to admit. And so we need something along the lines of a massive deployment of sensing and surveillance technologies that allow us to be sensitive to these initial bursts much earlier than we are now. And we're not entirely sure how to do this. I think we considered this a pretty good size open question. There was a nice discussion about whether or not metagenomics could be useful here, or other sorts of ways of doing large scale testing, such as pooled testing models or passive testing in water systems, these kinds of things. So there are ways in which we might be able to generate these pieces, but we need to be, we need the first part to know what to look for, and the second part, which is the investment in looking broadly. The pure side of this, I think, or at least one of the bridges between the pure and the applied, is invested in experimental model systems and a means for testing and evaluating those model systems. I think someone pointed this out earlier, which is that in respect to sandbox kinds of ideas, which is that we need to have a toy that we can play with, that we can use to test our sensing tools with, that we can use to test our modeling and diffusion tools with, that isn't itself already dangerous, right? So we need experimental viruses and ways of classifying these viruses on the biological side that helps us know that this class of mutations are where it's going to be dangerous. There's a risky way this has a little bit of risk, of course, to it, right? And so there's a long debate in the field on gain of function work and these types of things, ways in which bugs cross sets. And so we're not trying to reinvent that idea or think of it through that more, but we do think that there's clearly a point at which we need to think about how these either rare in humans or rare in the population sets of bugs make this jump. And so figuring that out is useful. We need to understand how sensitive settings are for spread, and so this is getting to the sort of the receiver side of this jumping goal, and this pre-identified set is that sometimes that the forest is dry and it's just going to take any spark, whereas other times the forest is clear and it's not going to light. So if you have a pre-deployed set of sensors that are social sensors that tell you these kinds of settings are the places where if a bug hits, it's going to go quick. That could be useful. And that's going to require a fairly heavy amount of investment in understanding of the ways in which people interact and the ways in which these bugs spread across the different classes of bugs that we're interested in. And so there was a good question about how we would do that. And this gets back again to this discussion about prediction versus preparedness and making sure that we don't see these as either or, but a well-apportioned balance between the two. And finally, data access. Modelers need more data. It's just like funding, we always want more data. But data access, especially to the very large data sets, is crucial. And to some degree, this has to be a shared resource. The models, the examples that were given were things like the investments in human genome databases and so forth. Like these were large scale pooled investments. And we need those kinds of things on the social side as well. So we need a way to figure out how we can be continuously monitoring, if not in real time, at least in large enough broad swaths so that we can make sense of cultural changes, family structure changes, work structure changes that would lead to a shift in risk and transmission, but dynamic risk. In our second session, then, we started talking more about this research infrastructure and data sharing question directly. And the first part of our session was just dedicated to these barriers to interdisciplinary collaboration. And I think these points were made already in the last two summaries, so I don't want to go over all of them in great detail, at least not the first one. But we just want to reiterate that common language problem is always a problem. Different terms mean the same thing, same terms mean different things. And so just making sure that we're aware of that and keep that up front is of course important. On the more substantive side, I think there was, sort of the little more novel side that, to our set anyway, there was a good question that was raised up about incompatible timescales. And this was really kind of an interesting one, which is on the one hand, you have policymakers who like need an answer tomorrow. And they want to know what the pandemic is going to look like tomorrow. And I haven't written the introduction to my paper in this week. So it's like the time scales for how academics work and how our world moves and basic research moves and the ways in which policy research moves can often be very different, and aligning those time scales is important. This is also true for different disciplines. So, in some of the natural sciences and computational sciences, papers get turned around in the order of weeks, whereas in the social sciences, you don't get scooped over the course of years. So there's an imbalance in the timescales and the length of papers and what the research process means. So making sense of those timescales, I think, is a difficult thing to do, both within academia and between this academics and applied continuum. There's this a question about sort of a subcategory of resources, which has to do with personnel and research capacity, right? So to be prepared for the next pandemic, we need an investment in a preparedness infrastructure, which is really, this is a non-trivial investment. And so this is, sort of the moonshot version of this kind of research question, which is not like, what can NSF do to fund more researchers, but what can we as a nation do to really be ready for the next big thing? And if we're serious about this, we have a Defense Department that prepares for wars that don't happen all that often and don't kill as many people as the last pandemic did. And so we kind of need, if you will, the CDC and the rest of our disease-based infrastructure to have that kind of investment. Clearly, that's outside of our scope, but a shift in our understanding of what it really means to be prepared once this hits would be a whole-scale reinvestment in public health, and so we should be aware of that in lots of ways. Finally, we need to consider the carrots, right? So there are a series in which we want to make sure that we're investing in ways that in our infrastructure and our research goals that make it attractive for people to jump into this field. Those of us that are already here, we're already here. We're busy, and it's not like all of us are out beating the bush because we're sitting on our thumbs with nothing to do. We need to bring more people in, and we need to bring more people in across lots of different scales, both within academics and within industry. And part of this is going to figure out what's the right way for us to collaborate with private industry. Like it or not, we're in a capitalist society with a for-profit motive. How do we align the interest of for-profit firms to get them moving in the direction that helps us be prepared for the next pandemic better? Finally, and this is my last slide, and then I'll wrap up. Sorry. For blabbering on so long. Finally, the inconsistent integration. This last question, again, is barriers to research. We think there's an inconsistent integration of socio-behavioral factors in the models. The point here is that we need to think about this across scales of going from a natural sort of biological problem to a human interaction problem that leads to a biological medical outcome. And that middle section of what the people are doing with each other, or how they're interacting with animals or places or other sort of risk vector sets, is a difficult one. And part of it is because humans are a mess. Like, we're so much randomness in what we do. But on the other hand, this mess has two sides. On the one hand, it's not mess without regularity. Human critters are somewhat routine, and this is there's lots of ways in which this is there, and we just need a good basic understanding. And I think, again, going back to the last point, some ongoing monitoring about how these goes. But the messiness also carries with it this feedback and reactive set, which is that human critters do have this sort of frustrating capacity to change what they do based on what they see around them, to be reactive and to apply meaning structures to things that layer on meanings to activities that might not have been anticipated prior to it happening. So masks in America are the current example, right? That, if prior to what has happened over the last 8 months, we would not have assumed that masks would have been a political issue. It would have been a comfort issue or whatever. But having it turned into a political issue quickly moves us to a new realm of behavior dynamics. And so being sensitive to how the same activity can carry multiplex meanings, and how those multiplex meanings are going to be, create feedback cycles that then feedback into our biological models, is a complicated feature that, again, we need to just be aware of and on top of in real time. There's a lack of it on the more pragmatic elements. This is very pragmatic, right? There's a lack of good data sharing infrastructure. I think there's a lot of us that were in this panel that are of the open science mindset and share everything. Some of us overshare, as was clear yesterday when I was throwing links around. But data templates and guides for good sharing are needed, right? We need a sense in which we can make it possible that when we share data, we do it in a way that's available and accessible so that people can use it between groups. There's a lot of problems with doing this well. And some of these, and we sort of broke these problems up into two classes. One of the classes is real data specific issues. So it's difficult to merge data from different administrative units, like zip codes and block groups and counties don't overlap in nice, neat ways. Timescales don't often overlap. Those of you that have been playing with the New York Times data, for example, or any of the other daily report data, see that for, a naive person wouldn't recognize that Saturday and Sunday, the pandemic seems to drop dramatically, right? And of course, that's not real. That just happens to be that there's a difference in which health departments report their data on the weekends and which don't. And so, those kinds of things are real administrative issues that have to do with funding and resources and so forth that we need to be aware of. And so the timescales are real, both in the data and in the noise that comes with those data. At the same time, there are a lot of non-disease relevant data sharing things that matter. Some of these are subject protection issues, so privacy issues and confidentiality issues and things like this that are non-trivial and important to gaining the trust of our participants in order to make sure we get the work done. Others of these are just ignorance on the part of investigators who are trying to do one-off data use agreements without any guidance, and so write something that they need not write, but the rest of us are then bound to down the road. So making sense of data use agreements and the legal constraints on that are really important, and finding ways in which we can get out of the business of doing one-off ad hoc data use agreements between every data collector and instead having good, clear guidelines from NIH, NSF, CDC on how best to do this with an eye towards shareability as opposed to, hoarding is something that we think would be quite useful. And finally, just the really mundane issues of data formats. So the different fields store data in different ways with different conventions. And these seem trivial until you spend, waste days or hours or months, trying to decode one person's data format to get it to work in your model. So ways in which we can standardize data and generation would be great. The one data structure to rule them all is probably never going to be true. We all have too many sunk costs in the way that we do our work. And so at a minimum, it seems like this does open the opportunity in the data science space for translation engines. So that it ought to be that it is a lot of work to do this data movement issues and data documentation and making sure it's clear and all this, and centralizing that work so that there's some pass-throughs that would ease us for those of us that are both producers and consumers might be quite useful. So that's what I had to say. I'm going to stop there. It was a lot of fun, and I would open it up to anyone else who was in the session if they wanted to correct me for what I missed.
Any corrections? Fantastic. Okay, so we're going to move to our break at this time, and we're going to have Dr. Pashilaitis is going to provide his remarks after our 15-minute break, but I do want to make sure that we take this time so everyone can grab a bite to eat or drink or whatever it is that you need at this particular time to come and continue to bring all of your brilliance into this conversation. So we'll take about 15 minutes. It looks like it is 12:17 right now, Eastern time. So we will start 2 minutes later to make sure everyone has a full break available. So we'll return with the report outs from group number 4, and then we'll move into our panel discussion. Okay, thanks everyone. We'll see you after the break. I hope that you all enjoyed the break and the extra few minutes that we had. We are going to jump back into our agenda at this point in time. And so we have heard report outs from 3 of the 4 breakout groups from day 1. This has been a great conversation so far. And so now we are pleased to welcome Dr. Pashilaitis, who is going to provide a review of the information that was discussed during breakout group number 4, during sessions 1 and 2 on day 1 of the workshop.
Okay, great. And hopefully you can see the slides in slide mode.
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
Awesome.
So the benefit of going last is that many of these points have been made. So I'll go over some of the points that were discussed in those two breakouts more quickly. So the first breakout, during breakout 1, the group dealt with integration of knowledge with action. And we started by discussing contributions to pandemic prediction from different disciplines that were represented. And I've highlighted with each one of these bullets some of the disciplines that I think are involved in each one of these bullets. So one is developing surveillance systems with statistical tools like anomaly detection, like quick change detection that was discussed, that are able to decipher statistically meaningful changes. And clearly here, some of the disciplines that are involved are engineering, sensing devices, and also theory around sensing, biology and bioinformatics, because we need sequencing, we need genomics type of information about viral or bacterial entities that are being discovered by the sensing, epidemiology, ecology, and statistics. Another need and contribution is on developing causal models. We talked about the ability to develop models that draw specific associations, but causality is a bit harder, and causality may be useful in some domains. So again, disciplines that are involved, epidemiology, statistics, AI, and machine learning. We talked about frameworks for decision and control, and clearly epidemiology, control decision theory, operations research, social sciences are involved. But it is also important to involve the public health and social sciences fields in order to contextualize these types of decisions and translate them into decisions that can be implemented in the real world, so that we can enable this more effective decision making. There is a need for dynamic models. The work of this type is being currently done, and there are contributions of this type to adapt to new information as it becomes available. This would enable, for instance, health officials to predict the impacts of various interventions, shutdowns, vaccine rollouts and distributions, and adjust responses. And there is also, mostly by the biology and by the bioinformatics community, ongoing analysis of viral genomes that would help link genomic data to disease severity. And this can, of course, create actions that are associated with this type of information. Barriers to interdisciplinary collaboration. Clearly, some of these points came up. There is no natural home for doing interdisciplinary work in pandemic prevention. Mechanisms and incentives within academic institutions do not necessarily favor or incentivize appropriately work across disciplines. There are clearly research centers that are playing to some extent that role, but I think it is recognized that we need to break more barriers within academic institutions and more broadly to enable interdisciplinary work. Another, I think, significant limitation that came up in the discussions is that academia is not really well suited to implement some of the recommendations and some of the innovations that are being discovered. So government partnerships are needed. So for instance, who is going to deploy these very large sensor networks that are going to collect information from Thailand or from other places that have lots of bats or other types of animals that are typically carriers of disease and different viruses. Who is going to put that information into appropriate databases so that people that work with data can actually get access to the data and do what they know how to do best. Another limitation is what perhaps one can call the interdisciplinary publications death valley. So if you think from the perspective of engineers, computer scientists, people that do theory and can contribute methods in this domain, they lack in some instances domain knowledge, and their publication venues do not necessarily appreciate more applied work. And on the other side, if you go to some of the bio and the medical publication venues, these venues are actually cautious of the more technical, the more modeling work. And there is a disconnect between the research and the medical communities that also get reflected in data sharing. So for instance, data generated by one community may not necessarily be helpful by the medical community because there is a lack of communication and there is sort of a lack of common language to be able to understand each other. So then we moved on to discuss research challenges. I think we talked about a better understanding of the evolution of pathogens in the animal world and how certain interactions in the animal world may lead to transmission of these pathogens to humans. There are challenges in obtaining data that study the interactions between animals and humans and also interactions within our own human world. Some of these interaction frequencies, for instance, can be informative for epidemic transmission models that take into account network structure. And a point that James made earlier on events that cannot necessarily could have been prevented, sort of the issues with mask wearing and that becoming a political football, the issues with social distancing. No matter how good your modeling is, it's probably impossible to predict some of these events that potentially have a primary effect in terms of how a pandemic evolves. Another, I think, issue that we discussed and also came up earlier in comments made by Nina is this boom and bust cycle. How do you convince people that working on preventive methods has actually some value? It's hard to measure the benefits of an event that does not occur, maybe will never occur, and it's hard even to measure benefits of events that occur fairly infrequently. I think, as a human race, we perhaps are focused on relatively shorter timescales, and events that evolve over longer timescales are a little bit harder to appreciate and understand their importance. So how do we address this type of issue in terms of sustaining funding and interest in that area? So then in breakout session 2, group 4 dealt with balancing prediction for severity versus likelihood of risks. Again, fairly broad topic, and obviously people have had different interpretations about what that topic meant. So we started with contributions to pandemic prediction in the context of this topic. So molecular therapeutics came up as offering computational platforms that can help identify molecules and therapies that may reduce the severity of the disease, but these may have side effects in the form of introducing safety hazards or even triggering mutations by the virus that you are trying to attack. We talked about machine learning considerations, perhaps you can even call them limitations. In general, in the machine learning and the AI community, it is easier to label severe cases and therefore identify them, so develop models that identify them. It is harder to identify cases that are milder, right? Because they are on the boundary of decision hyperplanes or decision barriers, if you're talking about non-linear necessarily decision barriers. So these are harder to make predictions for. On the other hand, you have fewer data that correspond to the more severe cases. So therefore, it becomes harder to learn what is the signature of those more severe cases and identify some of the factors that are driving these more severe cases. Distributional ecology came up as a discipline that is making important contributions in predicting distributions of vectors that carry pathogens and reservoirs for these vectors, and mapping these to likely outreach or outbreak scenarios. And epidemiology also obviously came up as it is a discipline that is fairly central to the topic of the entire workshop. We talked about barriers for predicting severity versus the likelihood of risks. So evaluating severity versus likelihood across diseases is difficult. It is easier potentially to do within one disease or within one family of diseases. We talked about barriers and limitations in machine learning and AI. For instance, not knowing what to look for. From a more technical perspective, unsupervised learning is harder than supervised learning. And potentially less developed. So that may be an area where more work needs to be done. In epidemiology, there is a challenge in understanding the point of transmission from one species to another, potentially because we don't have good sensing or because we don't have good models that try to understand these interactions. And then from a statistical perspective, estimate or applied probability, if you will, perspective, estimating the probability of events may be harder than estimating the pathway to a rare event. Sort of the idea being that, you know, if you have, for instance, a bunch of different exponentials that are decaying, characterizing the probability of different events, then clearly one is going to dominate, and that may give you insight about the specific pathway that leads to the event, but estimating the probability of that event may be harder in the absence of data. Barriers to predicting severity, again, versus likelihood of risks. Human responses to a pathogen may vary among individuals. And may differ obviously from responses in another animal species. So how can you make predictions about what will happen in individuals simply by observing the animal species and how they interact with certain virus? Pathogens behave differently in response to environmental factors. We talked about in bioinformatics, small sequence binding affinity changes in viral proteins may lead to very large changes in the structure of the viral human protein interactions. There is not, I think, as much work in understanding these effects. And clearly the bioinformatics community does not necessarily have the expertise to do this. One needs to tie them better with researchers that are able to forecast viral spread and the evolution of diseases, so people from epidemiology. And these cross-disciplinary discussions are to some extent limited. So that is that is a challenge. Other research challenges, there are researchers that are focused on specific diseases. They have their own pet disease, and it is actually rare to find researchers that cross disciplines. So this is part of the structural limitations that we discussed earlier. Interactions with the epidemic spreading community and some of the other communities that may develop information on how a virus may get transmitted from animals to humans, some of the bioinformatics and biology discussions and findings that I mentioned earlier, that would be helpful. And again, this has come up quite a bit, the institutional limitations, funding for interdisciplinary work, limitations within academia, and the lack of incentives for work across different disciplines. So I will stop here, at least in terms of the comments, and anyone who participated in those panels that would like to make any corrections, any additional comments on items I missed, you are very welcome to do so. Thank you.